I always thought moving into a lakefront property would be a dream. You know the type: peaceful mornings with coffee on the dock, kayak rides at sunset, and that smug satisfaction of finally making it. That's what the real estate brochure promised. And for the first 48 hours, it was exactly that. I had just closed on the place, a cozy but charming house with its own private dock extending into a sparkling waterway that connected to the main lake. I couldn't believe it was mine. I spent the first night on a folding chair, beer in hand, just soaking in the view. No noisy neighbors, no traffic, just the sound of water gently lapping against the dock. Bliss. But of course, as with all good things, peace is apparently illegal, at least in neighborhoods ruled by power-tripping HOAs. The trouble started on day 3. I had just finished putting together a new grill on the back deck when I noticed 3 people standing awkwardly near my dock. Clipboards, matching polos, sunglasses. The unholy trinity of suburban authority, the HOA. Leading them was a woman who introduced herself as Cheryl, president of the Lakeside Ridge Property Owners Association, whatever that meant. Behind her were 2 board members, one of whom was furiously writing notes as if my mere existence was already a violation. "You're the new owner?" Cheryl asked, already annoyed at the fact she had to speak to me. I nodded and smiled, trying to give off my best friendly neighbor vibe. It did not land. "We have an issue with your dock," she declared, skipping any sort of welcome. Just like that. No pie, no pamphlet, straight to business. Apparently, my dock, which had been there for over a decade and was included in the listing, was suddenly non-compliant with the HOA's waterfront uniformity guidelines. Uniformity. I had to bite my tongue to stop from laughing. They explained that it extended 6 feet further than it should, the railing didn't match the aesthetic of the community, and, this one killed me, the paint color didn't harmonize with the lakeside theme. I asked if that theme was gray and misery, but Cheryl didn't laugh. In fact, she told me I had 10 days to remove it or they would file a formal violation and begin issuing daily fines. I blinked. "You want me to remove the entire dock? The same one that's been here for years?" I asked. "Correct," she replied, eyes cold, like she'd waited her whole life to say that to someone. I asked them who had originally approved the dock, considering it predated me by a long shot. Cheryl waved it off like it was ancient history. That was before the HOA was formalized. It was never grandfathered in, so unfortunately, it's now in violation. The guy behind her, Steve I think, nodded like he was backing her up in a courtroom. It was ridiculous. I just spent a small fortune on a house advertised as having dock access, and now they were threatening to tear it down? Over paint and 2 feet of extra space? I politely told them I'd look into it, which was code for, "I'm not doing anything until I know exactly how much power you think you have." They left with a final warning, 10 days. And I went inside fuming. But I wasn't stupid. I didn't want to break any rules if they were real, and I certainly wasn't going to spend money fighting an HOA unless I had to. So I started digging. That's when I found the golden ticket, a little clause buried in the original deed to the house, referencing a shared use agreement with the Waterway Management District, a government body completely separate from the HOA. And guess who had final say over all docks and water access rights in the area? Not Cheryl. Not Steve. No. The Waterway supervisor. I made a few calls, sent a few emails, and within 48 hours, I had a meeting set up with a man named Glenn, the Waterway supervisor for the entire lake system. Glenn was awesome. The kind of guy who wore fishing shirts unironically and had strong opinions about the best bait for smallmouth bass. He reviewed my dock setup and laughed out loud when I told him about Cheryl's attempt to get it removed. "She's been trying to boss around the shoreline for years," he said, shaking his head. "Your dock's fine. It's compliant under our regs, and unless it's obstructing navigation or polluting the lake, the HOA has zero jurisdiction here." I could have cried. Instead, I asked him for that in writing. He grinned. "I'll do you one better, I'll send them a copy directly." True to his word, Glenn didn't just send me the documentation. He CC'd the entire HOA board in an email that was so politely savage, I read it 3 times for pure enjoyment. The subject line was, "Dock at 482 Lakeside Ridge, fully compliant with waterway regulations." Plain. Simple. Devastating. In the body, Glenn outlined every point that made my dock legitimate, from the original permit granted under the Shoreline Use Act to the fact that the dock was constructed before the HOA even existed. Any attempts to interfere with or demand removal of this structure may constitute a violation of state waterway authority, he wrote, cool as ice. Then came the real kicker. Please be advised that HOAs do not have legal authority over navigable waterways or permitted structures within them. Boom. Now, I don't know what kind of meltdown occurred on Cheryl's end when she opened that email, but judging by the fact that she showed up at my front door less than 2 hours later with a forced smile and twitching left eye, I can only assume her ego had taken a direct hit. "Hi again," she chirped as if we were old friends. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Can I help you, Cheryl?" Her voice was syrupy but strained. "Just wanted to touch base about your doc. There seems to have been a miscommunication." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? I thought Glenn's email was pretty clear." Her smile flickered. "Yes, well, you see, we were unaware that it had been permitted at the district level. We were simply enforcing community standards." The old backpedal. I'd seen it before in office politics, but seeing it in suburban warfare was something else. I didn't say anything. I just nodded slowly. Cheryl shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. "Anyway," she said, "since it's technically compliant, I suppose there's no further issue. We'll update our records." I smiled then, the kind of smile that says, "You lost." "Glad we got that cleared up," I said, stepping back to close the door. "Have a great day, Cheryl." But oh, she wasn't done. With one high-heeled foot still planted on my front step, she added, "We do hope you'll consider painting the dock to match the community's aesthetic guidelines." I stared at her. "I'll consider it," I replied, which in HOA speak translates to absolutely not. That should have been the end of it. Logical person might have taken the L and moved on. But Cheryl wasn't wired like that. She was the kind of person who couldn't sleep at night knowing someone out there wasn't following one of her self-made rules. I started noticing small things happening after that: passive-aggressive notes taped to my mailbox, anonymous complaints about noise, I live alone and don't even own a subwoofer, and one morning I found a citation on my trash bin for being improperly stored. It was behind my fence. Out of sight. I could feel the HOA turning into a petty suburban version of the mob. And then came the newsletter. Oh yes, they have a monthly newsletter, the Lakeside Ledger. Usually it was just updates about landscaping schedules and bake sales, but this edition had a very special feature on community compliance. The article didn't mention me by name, of course, but it warned residents about certain property owners who bypass HOA review processes and structures that, while technically permitted, disrupt the harmony of the shoreline. I laughed so hard I spilled coffee on the page. It was like watching someone try to shame me with interpretive dance. Desperate, subtle as a brick, and completely ineffective. I decided then that I wasn't just going to defend my dock. I was going to upgrade it. If they wanted to play petty, I'd go full Pinterest. Over the next 2 weeks, I added LED solar lighting along the railing, bought a couple of high-end Adirondack chairs in bold colors, not HOA gray mind you, and even installed a small weatherproof speaker that played soft jazz in the evenings. Every improvement followed district regulations. I triple-checked, but each one seemed to cause more stress wrinkles on Cheryl's forehead. I noticed her walking her dog past my house more frequently, always slowing just a bit as she glared at my lakeside paradise like it owed her an apology. But the final nail in the coffin? I hosted a barbecue. A good old-fashioned everyone's invited dockside cookout. I printed invites and handed them out myself, including to Glenn, the Waterway supervisor, who showed up with a six-pack and stories about how much he hated HOAs. Half the neighborhood came. Turned out, a lot of people had their own issues with Cheryl and her crew. People who'd been cited for things like unapproved mailbox flags or decorative rocks not matching ground color schemes. My party became a confessional. Stories flowed. Burgers sizzled. Cheryl stood across the street, arms folded, staring like she was watching Rome burn. Honestly, it was glorious. By the end of the night, Glenn had become the hero of the neighborhood, and I was no longer the new guy. I was the guy who stood up to the HOA, and won. Not just because I had the law on my side, but because I refused to play their petty power game. Cheryl and her board backed off after that, at least publicly. But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. People like Cheryl don't lose gracefully. They just retreat and scheme. But I was ready now. I had friends, allies, and Glenn on speed dial. Let her try something again. I'd be waiting, right there on my perfectly legal, district-approved, HOA-infuriating dock. If things had simply stayed awkward, I might have chalked it all up to a power-hungry HOA president having a bad month. But no, Cheryl had a special gift for escalation. After the dock debacle and the passive-aggressive newsletter, I thought she might settle into a simmering resentment. You know, glare from afar, whisper behind hedges, maybe throw a cold hello at the annual neighborhood meeting. But I underestimated her thirst for control. Because the next thing she went after wasn't my dock. It was my boat. Yes, My 14-foot John boat with a 9.9 horsepower engine and exactly zero potential to disrupt the shoreline harmony. The same boat Glenn himself helped me launch one Saturday. Cheryl must have looked out her window, saw me floating down the waterway with a cold drink and a fishing rod and thought, not on my watch. The first complaint came via email, not to me but to Glenn. She copied the entire HOA board and forwarded a blurry photo of my boat, floating peacefully like the menace it apparently was. In the message, she claimed it was creating a wake that threatened erosion, and was possibly being used for unauthorized commercial purposes. I had to read that line 3 times. What commercial purposes? Was she accusing me of running a secret lakeside Uber? Glenn once again handled it like a pro. He responded with a polite but unmistakable rebuke. Mr. Harris's boat meets all legal requirements for private use and has no recorded violations or complaints from neighboring docks. Please refrain from further baseless speculation. He didn't even BCC her. Glenn had entered the stage of polite professionalism where every word was a slap in the face. You'd think this would stop Cheryl, but of course, it only emboldened her. That week, I noticed a new sign appear near the boat launch at the end of our street. In all caps, all boats must be registered with the HOA. Below that, in smaller print, unregistered watercraft will be subject to citation and removal. I blinked. Was that even legal? Spoiler alert, absolutely not. I checked with Glenn again and he nearly choked laughing. They can't even enforce garbage can placement without a bylaw vote, he said. They sure as hell can't regulate boats on public access waterways. But here's where it gets wild. Cheryl had sent an actual letter to several neighbors demanding they submit photos of their boats, along with written statements of use, and a $50 registration fee. You'd think she was running a mini DMV out of her linen closet. The neighborhood listserv exploded. For the first time since I moved in, people who had once quietly accepted HOA overreach were speaking up. This is insane, one woman wrote. She can't regulate the lake. Another resident, who apparently hadn't spoken up since 2014, replied, HOAs are supposed to help communities, not create a suburban surveillance state. I was loving it. I didn't even have to lift a finger. Cheryl was now tanking her own credibility faster than I ever could. People began to share their stories openly. The guy at the end of the block, Greg, said he'd been fined for leaving a plastic flamingo on his lawn for more than 48 hours. An older woman named Mrs. Donnelly said she once got a warning because her Halloween decorations were too scary. It was HOA horror bingo, and Cheryl had called every square. And then came the big mistake. The line-crossing moment that turned the tide from neighborhood annoyance to full-blown outrage. Cheryl hired a private security firm to patrol the shoreline. I kid you not. 2 guys in beige uniforms started walking up and down the lake paths with clipboards and cameras. When I asked them who they were, they told me they'd been contracted to document compliance. I asked them under whose authority. They said, the HOA president. That night, someone posted a photo of one of the guards taking pictures of a kid fishing with his dad. The internet is fast. Within hours, parents were furious, the Facebook group was on fire, and even the non-confrontational residents were foaming at the mouth. Now remember, Cheryl hadn't gotten this power through a coup. She was elected. People had stopped showing up to meetings, let her rewrite small things without votes, and the next thing they knew, she was queen of the lake with a compliance army. But now they were awake. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. People brought printouts, photos, receipts, legal printouts. It looked like a courtroom crossed with a PDA meeting. I sat in the back, sipping a lemonade, watching the entire board squirm under the weight of democracy. Glenn had even sent a statement for public reading. It was read aloud like scripture. The HOA has no jurisdiction over waterways, docks, or vessels beyond their own communal property lines. Any future attempts to claim otherwise may be considered harassment. Cheryl tried to talk her way through it, but the spell was broken. The crowd wasn't buying it. Someone yelled, "You've got people taking pictures of our kids." Another added, "What are you gonna patrol next?" "Our kitchens." The motion to suspend the boat registration program passed unanimously. Then came the real cherry on top. A petition was circulated to call for a special election to remove Cheryl as HOA president. I didn't even need to circulate it. Greg, Flamingo Guy, practically tackled people with a clipboard. I went home that night to the sound of crickets and water lapping against the dock. No clipboards. No citations. Just peace. For now. Within a week of the neighborhood meeting, Cheryl's empire began to crumble. Not with a bang, but with the relentless shuffle of clipboards being returned to drawers and emails left unanswered. Her so-called compliance officers vanished overnight. One of them, I later found out, had quit mid-shift after a woman accused him of violating her Fourth Amendment rights for trying to look over her backyard fence. The $50 boat registration fee was quietly refunded via awkward checks signed by the HOA treasurer. Poor guy looked like he aged 10 years that month. People had had enough, and Cheryl's reputation went from strict to power-drunk faster than a Florida storm. At the heart of it all was the same issue she couldn't seem to get past: my dock. That cursed, glorious Glenn-approved dock. Now, I didn't gloat, not publicly at least. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the irony. I was the newcomer. The outsider. And yet, thanks to Cheryl's obsession with control, I'd somehow become the unofficial face of anti-HOA rebellion. People waved at me now when I took my boat out. Greg even brought me a pink flamingo as a gift, which I proudly placed next to my dock stairs, complete with a tiny captain's hat and a laminated sign that said HOA approved. Cheryl must have hated it, but she couldn't do anything. She no longer had the votes. That special election? Oh, it was happening. And it was brutal. The vote itself was held on a sunny Saturday morning under a big tent in the community park. Coffee and donuts were provided, not by the HOA but by the residents. That was telling. There was a clipboard station, ballots, and even a little donation jar labeled, "For HOA reform, let's take it back." More than 70% of the neighborhood turned out, which was record-breaking compared to the usual sleepy 5-person showdowns. Cheryl arrived late, wearing sunglasses and a stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her loyal board members flanked her like they were trying to form a defensive line. The tension was thick, like everyone was waiting for a firework to misfire. When the results were read, it wasn't even close. 89% voted to remove Cheryl as president. The vote to replace the entire board? Passed. Unanimously. There was a quiet moment. No cheering, no chaos. Just a collective exhale, like the neighborhood had been holding its breath for years and was finally allowed to breathe. Cheryl didn't say anything. She just nodded, tight-lipped, and walked out. No farewell speech. No, thank you for your time. Just the click of her heels fading into the distance. It was oddly anticlimactic but somehow perfect. Like a villain in a movie who realizes they lost the battle not to a rival but to their own ego. The newly elected board was a mix of level-headed parents, retirees who actually read bylaws, and a young couple who ran a popular Instagram page about lakeside gardening. Immediately, things began to change. The absurd rules were suspended pending review. The board held open Q&A sessions. People actually started liking the HOA emails, which now included tips for fishing, recipes, and reminders about trash pickup, not citations or threats. They even held a neighborhood picnic and asked me to bring my boat for rides. Me. The guy who was nearly fined into oblivion for having a non-compliant dock. Talk about a plot twist. And yet, something in me stayed cautious. Cheryl might have been dethroned, but she still lived here. Her house sat just 3 doors down, windows always drawn, lawn now suspiciously perfect. Every time I walked my dog past her place, I felt her eyes on me, not in a horror movie way but in that unfinished business way. The kind of look someone gives when they've accepted the loss but not the lesson. And sure enough, one afternoon it happened again. A letter. In my mailbox. No envelope. Just a single typed page with no signature. Read. You may have won the dock battle, but this community still deserves order. We'll see how long your allies remain loyal when things get messy again. Petty? Yes. Threatening? A little. But mostly it was sad. Cheryl had gone from self-appointed queen to anonymous note passer. She was powerless now and she knew it. I considered reporting the letter to the new board, but I didn't. What was the point? She'd already lost everything that mattered to her in this little kingdom. All because she picked a fight over a dock she had no control over. Let that be her punishment. Still, I kept the letter, tucked it into a folder labeled HOA Drama, for Glenn. Just in case. Because if there's one thing I'd learned by now, it's this. Don't underestimate how far a bitter ex-president will go when her clipboard's been taken away. I'd almost started to believe the storm had passed. The new HOA board was chill, the neighborhood vibe was better than ever, and my dock had become a sort of anti-HOA landmark, lovingly dubbed Freedom Pier by Greg and the other newly empowered residents. People were planting flower beds without filling out permission slips. Kids were chalking smiley faces on sidewalks without fear of citations. Even the newsletter had undergone a glow-up, now featuring community pets, lake photography, and a sarcastic recurring column called Cheryl's Greatest Hits, a satirical nod to her most ridiculous rules, like the infamous no lawn ornaments taller than 18 inches policy. Life was peaceful again. Which is exactly when things started to feel off. It began subtly, little whispers at neighborhood gatherings. Did you hear Cheryl's running again? Apparently she's going door to door. I dismissed it at first. No way she'd have the nerve. After being booted in a landslide, publicly embarrassed, and essentially exiled from her own castle, she wouldn't possibly want to crawl back into the mess, right? Wrong. Because 3 weeks later, taped to my mailbox with cheerful blue painter's tape, was a flyer: Vote Cheryl, Restore Order, Reclaim Community. It featured her airbrushed headshot, a bulleted list of vague promises, enhanced safety measures, stronger property value protections, and not-so-subtle jabs like, say no to chaos and yes to leadership that works. Chaos? Really? Lady, the worst thing that's happened here in months is someone's gnome got stolen. Still, the flyer was real. So was the campaign. Cheryl was attempting a comeback, and this time she was playing a longer, quieter game. Instead of commanding from her porch or enforcing fake boat rules, she was hosting low-key coffee meetups at her house, inviting longtime residents and buttering them up with fresh muffins and fake humility. I heard she even handed out custom pens that said calm, clean. Cheryl. Who was she, a yoga app? Now, I wasn't about to start a smear campaign. That wasn't my style. But I also wasn't going to let her gaslight the entire neighborhood into thinking she'd just been misunderstood. Luckily, I didn't have to act alone. The neighborhood had changed and people remembered. Greg organized a community Q&A night ahead of the next board vote. Open to all candidates, open to all questions. If she wants the job back, he said, she can earn it the honest way. In public. I offered to bring snacks. Greg told me to bring facts. When the night arrived, it was standing room only again. The new board members gave brief, thoughtful statements. A young mom named Priya, running for vice president, spoke passionately about keeping the HOA from becoming a power tool. Then Cheryl stepped up. She wore a navy blazer, smiled like she'd just forgiven us all, and began her speech. I know there were misunderstandings during my previous term. But I believe order, consistency, and respect for property values are not things to be mocked, but cherished. She even glanced at me during the word mocked. Cute. Then came the Q&A. It started tame. A few softball questions about landscaping budgets and snow removal. But soon hands started rising, sharp, specific questions from people who had lived through Cheryl 1.0. What exactly were the credentials of the security patrol you hired? Asked Greg. Why did you charge residents $50 for boat registrations that weren't legally required? Asked Mrs. Donnelly. Did you really find someone for flying a pride flag? Asked a college kid who had just moved back home. Cheryl's smile began to crack like a frozen pond in March. And then it was my turn. I kept it calm. You told me my dock was illegal. You tried to fine me, intimidate me, and undermine my property rights. You were wrong on every count. So my question is simple. If elected again, would you respect the legal limits of the HOA's power, or go back to inventing new ones? The room went silent. Cheryl looked right at me, jaw tight. I was doing what I believed was best for the community. I raised my eyebrows. That's not an answer. The applause was immediate, not loud but steady. And Cheryl's expression? Priceless. By the end of the night, the writing was on the wall. Her comeback campaign had backfired. The community wasn't the same as it was a year ago. People were engaged now. Informed. No longer afraid of a woman with a clipboard and a complex. The election results the following week confirmed it. Cheryl didn't just lose, she came in dead last. Not even her old allies backed her this time. I guess even muffins have their limits. And just like that, her second reign ended before it began. No speeches this time. No flyers. Just silence. The last trace of her campaign, a soggy pen, was found in a gutter 3 days later. Greg kept it as a trophy. With Cheryl's second defeat sealed and the flamingo on my dock now considered a local mascot, the neighborhood finally began to feel like a community, not a kingdom. People were planting what they wanted, painting their shutters whatever color made them happy, and, perhaps most importantly, living their lives without a constant fear of fines disguised as friendly notices. The new HOA board was everything the old one wasn't. Transparent, responsive, and totally uninterested in playing dictator. Still, I couldn't shake a feeling that had been building ever since the election. Cheryl wasn't done. Not in the running for office again sense. She wouldn't dare after being publicly thrashed twice. No, this was something subtler. And quieter. A slow-brewing, passive-aggressive insurgency I came to call the Whisper War. It started with little things, small annoyances that didn't register as suspicious at first. My trash bin was mysteriously left out on collection day with the lid removed. Packages left at my door would be just slightly opened, like someone had lifted the flap to peek inside. My mailbox had been fine for a year, then suddenly started malfunctioning, refusing to close all the way, even though I'd replaced the latch myself. Coincidence? Maybe. But then the anonymous notes returned. This time they were even pettier. One read, "Your outdoor string lights exceed the recommended lumens for a lakeside property. Please be considerate." Another, "The dock is beginning to show signs of mildew. A responsible homeowner would act." I knew exactly who it was. And not just because Cheryl's writing had a very distinct cadence, the kind of faux formal tone you'd expect from a failed hall monitor with a Microsoft Word template. No, it was the method. She didn't have power anymore, so she did what people like her always do: gossip, meddle, and weaponized neighborhood anxiety. I began hearing from other residents too. "Hey, did you hear someone's been calling in false complaints to the city about non-permitted structures? Someone posted on the community board asking if your boat is commercial use." It was classic Cheryl. She couldn't beat me publicly, so she turned to shadow games, sowing little seeds of doubt, hoping someone else would do her dirty work for her. Now I could have let it go. Could have ignored the notes, brushed off the rumors, and waited for her to get bored. But the problem is, I've never been great at playing defense when someone's clearly trying to provoke me. I wasn't going to go nuclear, I'd already won that war, but I was more than happy to engage in a little psychological chess. So I started responding. Not directly, of course. That would ruin the fun. Instead, I made some adjustments to the dock. First, I installed a motion-activated spotlight, pointed just slightly in the direction of Cheryl's property. Not enough to be intrusive. Just enough that any movement in her bushes triggered a full-on floodlight like she was being interviewed on national TV. Then I added a waterproof Bluetooth speaker under the dock, which played bird sounds during the day and light ambient jazz in the evenings. Why bird sounds? Because Cheryl had previously campaigned to ban wind chimes, citing audio pollution. I figured she'd love a full soundscape of cardinals and loons. But my favorite addition was the new sign: "Private Dock, Waterway Supervisor Verified." Big bold letters. Laminated. With Glenn's signature at the bottom. I sent him a picture. He replied with a single word: "Savage." I didn't see Cheryl outside for a few days after that. Maybe she was regrouping. Maybe she was just running out of fumes. But the whisper war wasn't over yet. One evening while I was out grilling cedar plank salmon, if you're wondering, I heard what sounded like a camera shutter behind my fence. I paused, grabbed my phone, and walked around the side of the house just in time to see a familiar figure in a windbreaker speed walking away from the edge of my yard. Phone in hand. Sunglasses on. It was Cheryl. Caught red-handed. I didn't say a word. Just held up my own phone and snapped a photo right back. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. "You want to play games? I've got the receipts." The very next day, I received a letter from the city code office. A formal request for inspection based on multiple citizen concerns about unauthorized shoreline development. I actually laughed out loud when I opened it. Not because it wasn't serious, but because I knew how this story ended. I forwarded the letter to Glenn, attached the photo of Cheryl creeping behind my yard, and asked him if he could verify, again, that everything was compliant. He replied within the hour, "Inspection not necessary. We've already documented your dock. I'll handle this." That was Glenn's version of a mic drop. A week later, I got another email, this time from a city official, apologizing for the confusion. Apparently, Glenn had personally contacted them to explain that my property had already been inspected and cleared under state regulations. No violation. No further action required. Case closed. But the best part? The city now had a formal record of Cheryl's repeated, baseless complaints. And let's just say, flagging herself as a nuisance filer probably wasn't on her campaign flyers. At this point, even the neighbors who used to stay neutral were done pretending. Cheryl's passive-aggressive reign had shifted from annoying to embarrassing. People started actively avoiding her at events. Someone even made a parody Facebook page, Chairman Cheryl's Neighborhood Watch. It was glorious, filled with memes of binoculars, screenshots of bylaws, and fake citations for things like laughing too loud on a Tuesday. And me? I just kept fishing. It's been 6 months since Cheryl's last act of suburban espionage, and life has never been calmer. The HOA is now what it was probably always meant to be, a boring group of volunteers making sure the neighborhood doesn't fall apart. No more rogue security patrols. No clipboard crusades. No threats over flamingos or light bulbs or string lights. Just block parties, clean sidewalks, and the occasional newsletter recipe for slow cooker chili. I think Cheryl still lives here, her blinds are always drawn, and her mailbox has started to collect coupons that no one picks up, but no one really talks about her anymore. Her name has faded into legend, like a cautionary tale parents whisper to kids playing too close to the HOA handbook. As for me, I've carved out my little slice of lakeside freedom. The dock is better than ever. I repainted it, in full compliance of course, added a new canopy and even bought a second kayak after Greg suggested we start a weekly dock meet. Every Saturday morning, a few neighbors gather with their coffees, sit in their boats or lawn chairs and swap stories. Someone brings muffins. Someone else brings gossip. And everyone jokes about the dock wars, like it was some ancient chapter of neighborhood lore. It's oddly unifying, like surviving a shared natural disaster, except instead of rain, it was paperwork and passive aggression. Glenn still stops by once a month, usually under the pretense of routine shoreline review, but I suspect it's mostly to drink beer and chuckle about the time he accidentally became a local folk hero. We even made him a fake trophy that says, Local Government MVP, for services rendered during the Great HOA Uprising. He laughed so hard he almost dropped it into the lake. He keeps it on his office shelf now, right between a base sculpture and a plaque from the county. Every time he visits, he reminds me, if you ever want to get into waterway management, we could use someone who's not afraid of a fight. I always tell him the same thing, I'm good right here. And I am. It's funny, I moved out here to escape the noise of the city, the grind of traffic, the fake smiles of downtown condo boards. I thought I was trading in one kind of chaos for peace. Instead, I found a new kind of chaos, quieter, sneakier, and obsessed with shrub height regulations. But somehow I landed on the right side of it. Not because I was the loudest or the angriest, but because I was willing to stand up, and because I had Glenn, and Greg, and a whole neighborhood of people who were tired of being ruled by someone who thought a clipboard gave her a crown. Sometimes I still find little reminders. A bent signpost someone tried to remove. A faded note Cheryl probably meant to intimidate me with. A leftover vote Cheryl pen chewed up by a raccoon. They're relics now. Proof that even in the calmest communities, power can twist people into something unrecognizable. And that it only takes one person, or one dock, to make them snap. And maybe, just maybe, to make everyone else wake up. The flamingo on my dock now has a new friend. A little plastic gator wearing sunglasses. Greg said it's to ward off evil spirits and past presidents. I say it's just good decor. Either way, they stand together at the edge of the pier, silently judging anyone who thinks they can rule with fear instead of reason. Do I regret moving here? Not even for a second. Would I have chosen a different house if I knew all this would unfold? Honestly, no. Because now, every time I sit out on that dock, legally, proudly, peacefully, I'm reminded of something Glenn once told me over a cold beer. They can't take what they don't own. And that's the truth about power, it only works if you let it. So here I stay. Dock secure. Boat ready. Neighbors united. And somewhere behind those drawn curtains, a former queen learning the hard way that the lake doesn't belong to her.